Poland has rejected Moscow's report into the deadly plane crash that killed 96 people, including the country's president, last April in southwest Russia. The Prime Minister Donald Tusk has criticised the findings, describing them as groundless and unacceptable. Well, to discuss the investigation into the crash, we can now cross to David Kaminski-Morrow, who's an aviation journalist joining us from London. Thanks very much indeed for being with us here on RT. Now, the Polish Prime Minister, he slated the investigation but didn't actually go into detail. Why do you think the report could be unacceptable to him?
Well, I think it's very simply a case of you're dealing with a highly political situation. This was really a perfect storm in terms of the worst possible combination of circumstances for this accident to have happened. And I think that the result of the investigation is going to be a very bitter pill for the Polish government to swallow. I think the evidence that's come out so far in the reports that have been issued as the investigation has progressed have pointed increasingly towards catastrophic decision making on board the aircraft, and I suspect that Prime Minister Tusk is finding that a very difficult thing to accept. And I suspect,
well, you've been following this from the very start, and based on the experience and your work, would you say those conclusions really are quite valid from what you can see?
I think there's no doubt in my mind that the Interstate Aviation Committee, which has been handling the investigation, is a professional organisation. I've followed several of their reports. They are detailed, they are accurate, and the Russians are not afraid of criticising, issuing criticism where criticism is due, even to their own aviation industry and their own airlines if necessary. And I've seen nothing that's come out so far that suggests that this investigation is anything less than it ought to be. So
are you saying, in fact, this is a fairly straightforward incident? Because surely tragedies like this are very difficult to investigate, aren't they?
Well, there's a lot of information that comes out from the circumstances of an accident, flight recorders, detailed recordings of things like radar tracks and so on and so forth. And while the cockpit voice recorder on the aircraft needed a lot of cleaning up, there was a lot of damage to the critical conversations that were being heard on board. The other evidence combined is pointing essentially to the captain of the aircraft making the decision to attempt a landing in very bad weather and then ignoring a warning system on board the aircraft to abort the landing. And this is the captain's responsibility. The question that needs to be asked is why the captain of this aircraft proceeded with such an outrageously dangerous landing. And I think that's the issue that Poland needs to come to grips with.
But just how much, though, would the Poles have been involved in this investigation?
I think the Russian side has kind of fallen over itself, really, to try and keep this investigation as open as possible. They're very much aware of the sensitivity. This issue involves the Polish president. It involves a flight to the site of the Katyn massacre. It doesn't get any more sensitive than this. And I think the Russians have been extraordinarily keen to keep the Poles informed, to show that they're being open, to show that they're being transparent, and if the conclusions are something that the Poles don't like, well, it's up to them to either accept it or not accept it as they wish. But it doesn't change the facts of the investigation.
The conclusions which you're alluding to are the fact it's a Polish pilot at the controls at the time of that incident. But nevertheless, there are still disagreements over this investigation. Could there be another one now? I mean, what happens next?
I think it will be very hard to hold another investigation. I mean, you're talking to the Russian side, to the Interstate Aviation Committee. It doesn't matter who was on board or where the aeroplane was going. This is very simply an aeroplane crash, and they've investigated it as an aeroplane crash. the conclusions are what they are.
But nevertheless, surely the Poles may have a case here, because they're saying this investigation doesn't actually fully comply with the Chicago Convention. The Chicago Convention. Now, that is a regulatory international travel body. Surely, if there are some stipulations to be met, why haven't they been?
I think that, in my personal view, and I've not seen the final accident report yet, so I'm kind of preempting it. In my view, the conclusions, the evidence that's come out so far is pointing very much on the side of this being a problem on board the aircraft itself, and I think anything else it's almost starting to sound tantamount to nitpicking. As we say in England, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck.
Yeah, but nevertheless, the Pole side is not happy about this, and if it isn't in line with international conventions, would perhaps involving international investigators at this stage be prudent, so there'll be absolutely no question over what happened, because there'll be no political implication or any other element involved?
Well, the problem is I think that even if you brought in an international body that was completely independent, it would probably end up coming to the same conclusions. And the fact is the Poles don't like the conclusions. It's their Air Force, their aircraft commander that's made the decisions to try to land an aircraft in appalling weather conditions and ignore a warning system on board the aircraft that said don't do it. I mean, it doesn't get really any simpler than that. There may be fine detail around that the Poles are not happy with, but as far as I'm concerned, I see nothing that suggests that the Russian conclusions to this investigation are out of order.
Just finally, though, relations between Poland and Russia have really dramatically improved. Could this have a negative impact, you think?
I think it may have a temporary negative impact, but ultimately, I think once the dust is settled, I think it'll be part of history, and it won't get in the way of Poland-Russia relations in future.
All right, thanks very much indeed. Aviation journalist David Kaminski-Morrow joining us there, the European editor at Air Transport Intelligence, joining us there in London. Thank you very much indeed.